Few anime or manga can claim the same reputation as Gintama. Beloved for its characters and notorious for its ludicrous humor, my observation has been that most people love its writing and tone, some people are put off by its eccentricities, but ultimately, everyone remembers this show. In the internet space, Gintama has amassed a presence like JoJo's or One Punch Man, largely because of how quirky it can be. And of course, I can see why it's often taken in that direction, but leaving it as just a mimetic template frankly misses the point on why this series is so universally beloved. Strike up a conversation with any serious Gintama fan, and you'll notice it quickly moves away from the satirical humor and pop culture references, drifting into the territory of an insane storyline, supported by a beloved cast of characters and heartfelt passion. Today we're going through 5 picks under distinct categories, using them as case studies to represent what I believe to be the appeal and soul of the King of Mal. These are going to be some of, in my opinion, the best moments in the series, but there isn't really a ranking because this isn't a traditional top 10 video, since I'm avoiding overlap, and, all of that. Fine, my titles are clickbait. You're on YouTube, what did you expect? Don't click away, please. Gintama is best known for its episodic comedies, which make up a large majority of the anime adaptation, so it's only fair that we start off on a lighthearted pick for best sketch comedy before things get darker. I'll preface by saying that this one is objectively impossible to choose. There are just so many phenomenally funny moments throughout this series, to the extent that trying to pick one would have been a disservice to Hideaki Sorachi's comedic writing. If you think I'm kidding, here are all the honorable mentions. The memory loss, the toilet paper battle, the smoker saga, the popularity poll, soul switch arc, the friggin' Santa arc, anything with the Shogun, the scandal arc, Kuroko no Taisuke, the illness chapter. Yeah, that's a lot to take in. When I finally had to sit down and think about it though, I ended up going with Yamazaki's entrance exam in episode 109. Because for as much as I love Gintama, its humor doesn't always hit for me, sometimes coming across as obscene or cringy. And I'll acknowledge the double standard. I think Tatsuma barfing on a guy is kinda weird, while the penile break is friggin' hilarious, because that's just how the subjectivity of humor goes. What makes this moment in this episode stand out for me is how little context is required for it. Sure, you need to know the characters and the setting, more or less, but this is an episode that is less reliant on inside jokes and recurring gags, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates Sorachi's ability to set up a punchline.
もはや上位と何の関係もねえよジャッキーわかんねえ普通に難しい正解は花だそれお前がジャッキーの鼻気になってるだけだろうがでは正解ジャッキーやっぱ鼻でかくねです
You see, Gintama's comedy primarily uses a combination of parody and traditional Japanese manzai skits. A funny man, or boke, initiates with something silly or unorthodox, while the straight man, or tsukkomi, reacts to it. This manzai routine rarely gets old because the roles are flexible here. Someone like Gintoki primarily plays the funny man, but they can also take up the tsukkomi role under some circumstances.
その戦いっぷり白い肌日よけの網がさやっとか集まってめなんつう危ねえやつ副官にしてやがったんだえやっとなんじゃそれ知らなかったんかい
Gintama thrives off this basic comedic structure, but also throws in outlandish elements and satirical references to keep things fresh. This is particularly relevant in our pick, since the setups mostly deal with wordplay, fairly popular real-life figures, and the general absurdity of the situation, making this whole comedic routine rather accessible as far as Gintama episodes go. The punchlines are self-contained, but they're also sudden, unapologetic, and pretty damn stupid, because that's what Gintama does. It subverts its characters, world building, sometimes even its own narrative to create humor. Take my boy Zura. Shut up. Just look at his role in the story, his design, his drip, his voice. He has the aura of a serious, dignified character. A respectable samurai. Nope. Taken holistically, he's probably the stupidest character in this entire damn show. Mario じゃない。
やるなら今しかねえスラやるなら今しかねえスラジョイがジョイジョイがジョイ俺が好きなのは人妻などではない寝取られだ
いやよっぽどブスらしくない性癖暴露してますけど
And you know what? I love this guy. He's the MVP of this pick, and he's pretty damn funny. Now, anyone who knows their way around Gintama knows it's impossible to mention comedy without thinking about the Shogun. A central figure in the world building and narrative of the series, he has so much going for him that screams consequential authority figure. So if you were listening to a single thing I just said about subversion, you probably get where this is going.
俺たちの力をものともしていない何者だあの男人間の体のどこからブレーキが出てくるんだよ全ブレーキうまくねえんだよやめろもうそれ以上ブレーキは使うな世継ぎが生まれなくなる
Tokugawa Shigeshige is generally a herald to some of the funniest, most outrageous episodes in Gintama. If you're a fan, you know what's up the instant you hear Shogun Kayo! And yet, his lasting impact on the series and fanbase isn't as the butt of a bunch of jokes. As with most of the characters, there's a lot more depth and consequence to this lovable goofball. But none of the moments we shared with him were as emotional or shocking as the last ones. A turning point in the story, Shigeshige's death was a masterclass in narrative subversion. After an entire action-packed arc of protecting the Shogun from ninja, aliens, and the main villain of the series, he's assassinated in the most mundane way possible by a nameless extra. And somehow, it's oddly appropriate. You see, for a series about samurai in an anachronistic setting, Gintama never really celebrates traditional samurai culture. Sure, it plays up their values and aesthetic, but it was never about a bunch of samurai fighting the times to preserve their culture. Throughout this series, there's an acceptance of the inevitability of social progress, and the need to adapt your practices as older institutions collapse. Shigeshige's death is honestly no different, being the narrative culmination of a storyline around the decay of the shogunate. Shigeshige himself would be replaced, but his successor would end up suffering the same fate, an anticlimactic and shockingly sudden demise that would finish off the increasingly fragile institution that he represented.
最後の将軍として私は彼らと共に行かねばならない王なき時代が来るそなたらなら大丈夫だろう
To be fair, Nobunobu's death evoked similar emotions, and although his terrific growth as a person makes him possibly more tragic, he's not an accurate depiction of how Gintama characters are written, partly because of being introduced later and having fewer comedic gags going for him. The benefit of having the manga framed as a comedy is that Sorachi has a better meta-understanding of our attachment to these characters. He understands that we'll mourn them for who they are and what they represent. The Shogun's death is sad because we know we'll never see him in comical situations and never hear Shogun Kayo! Ever again. Gintama is fundamentally about the status quo surrounding its characters, not the development they experience. So while Nobunobu's last moments are sad because they show how far he's progressed as a character, Shigeshige's final moments are the exact opposite. He dies as he lived, a responsible ruler and brother, honest to a fault, who tries and fails to maintain appearances, because he's unashamed of showing his vulnerability. And so, as he passes on, we all sit in silence, reminded of what we just lost. This seems as good a place as any to talk about fight scenes. I mean, this is shonen anime. Of course some of the most important moments in the series are going to be carried by the action. Naturally, I'll have to go with the fight in Gintama. Gintoki versus Takazuki. Featuring some of the best animation up till that point in the anime, as well as an unprecedented sense of scale and brutality, this one's pretty hard to beat in terms of raw impact. Sure, you can argue some of the later fights might have better animation, choreography, or hype, but in my opinion, nothing matches this one by virtue of its narrative significance. To understand why, let's look at a personal favorite moment of mine, Gintoki vs Jiraiya in the Red Spider arc. I know it's not as celebrated as some of the later moments, but between the story it told, the past it revealed, and its unique artistic gimmick, I almost gave it a spot on this list. Almost. Because I realized something. Throughout that fight, and throughout that entire arc, Gintoki only reveals what he feels is relevant about his past, never the entire picture. In fact, this can be said of Gintoki over the series as a whole. He never reveals much about his past, and even when he does, it's only the parts that are relevant to the situation, the things that enriched him as a person. Frankly, 300 episodes in, I was convinced we would never see his whole story. And I was right. This whole fight is told from Takazuki's perspective. Every element of the backstory, every plot reveal, it's all from Takazuki, because that's the only way we were ever going to hear it. Takazuki defines himself as a villain and as a person by the shackles of his past failures. The story of his present is written by his past, hence the fight's frequent cuts and transitions. Compare this to Gintoki, who rarely reflects on his past failings because he's come to accept and learn from them. While Takazuki remembers Shoyo by his inability to save him, Gintoki remembers their teacher by the compassion he was shown and taught to show to others. This is apparent throughout the series, especially during the Jiraiya fight, and in fact, the only flashback throughout the Takazuki fight shown from Gintoki's perspective is a brief display of Shoyo's selflessness, his final lesson to Gintoki.
ありがとう。
And so, this fight is ultimately a depiction of a flawed and haunted character taking out his frustrations on his more mature, fully realized counterpart. It almost inverts the roles of hero and villain, making Gintoki seem like a heartless accessory to Takazuki's traumatic backstory. And once again, we see Sorachi's signature writing motif of explaining these characters to us by letting them be who they are at crucial moments, instead of changing or developing them. As we saw in the flashbacks, since youth, Takazuki has dealt with his shortcomings by duking it out with Gintoki. He hides behind the facade of terrorism and hatred, but the only thing he hates is his own weakness, and because he's always had so much in common with Gintoki, he relieves his frustrations on himself by taking them out on his alter ego.
俺たちはてめえに刃を突き立てることはできねえが、俺にはお前がいる!
When he's finally confronted with the reality behind his actions, he realizes he's still the same naive delinquent who never graduated Shoyo's teachings. Takazuki is one of the later examples in a long history of Gintama villains defined by the past they experienced. Look through most of the serious arcs in the story to notice that all of them tie into the spillover effects of the past, with most of the villains being forced to accept or overcome them, tying back to the inevitability of progress, a major theme in Gintama. So it's only appropriate that the big bad of the series would be the very embodiment of the past itself. Utsuro's introduction in episode 314 already ticks all the boxes for an epic villain entrance. A haunting sense of tension and ominous soundtrack herald his entrance, and he wastes no time establishing who he is. That presence, those moves, that drip, that voice. It doesn't even take him all of 2 minutes to clarify who's top dog. And all of that's before he reveals what he is.
君は知っている。君の剣は私には届かない。
Utsuro's identity is one of the biggest reveals in the entire series, not just for the shock factor, but also for what it represents. After 300 plus episodes of learning what a fully realized character Gintoki is, Utsuro only needs a single episode to take all of his failings and shove him back at him. You see, what's so interesting about Utsuro as an immortal character isn't how he wipes the floor with everyone, but how different a role he plays. Most often, immortality is associated with the fear of stagnation and a desperation for progress. Although Utsuro technically does want to die, he narratively represents regression. He digs up the past regrets and demons of the main cast, destroying their sense of resolution by embodying the immortality of their mistakes. Most amazingly though, he communicates most of this in a single episode, appropriately titled Karma. He wrecks most of the cast, shocks the audience, and shakes a typically unfazed Gintoki to his very core. All in a single episode. For this final pick, I really wanted to talk about Resolution, because as much as I miss Gintama, it's one of those series that leaves you satisfied even though you want more. I wanted to put the visually spectacular final battle between Gintoki and Utsuro here. It's one of my favorite moments, period. But given we had a Gin vs Utsuro moment in just the last pick, I refrained. And that's possibly for the best, since I could instead dedicate this pick to one of my favorite low-profile characters in the show, Oboro. Right from his introduction, Oboro was one of the major league villains, to the extent that he could be considered the big bad before Utsuro came along. Cold and unfeeling for the most part, he finally got his moment in the limelight during the Rakuyo arc, when his past was revealed during a final battle with Takazuki. The setup was strong to begin with, as Oboro is haunted by his past decisions, just as Takazuki laments his past inabilities. But to be honest, I just spoke about how every Gintama villain carries baggage, so what's so special about Oboro? I think it really comes down to regret. Unlike most Gintama villains who lost their way, Oboro was almost instantly aware of his failures, but never had any path forward that he wouldn't also regret. Knowing where he went wrong but being unable to ever learn from it meant he would never know peace, except in his fantasies.
もしやり直せるのなら俺はお前たちになり
It also helps that Oboro turns out to be one of the most consequential characters in the entire series. He plays an underappreciated but hugely important role in the finale, his mistakes lead to one of the defining moments in the story, and it could be argued his respect and selfless sacrifice for his master would define the man that Yoshida Shoyo would become, and that his disciples would later emulate. I initially considered giving this spot to Isaburo Sasaki's death. It's a beautiful scene that sends off one of my favorite characters, but the nuance is just so different.
信じてよかった。信目さん、メールやっと届きましたよ。
Isaburo was a man tortured by failures he could never escape or learn from, but he managed to find beauty and purpose in life in spite of it. For me, Oboro breaks the norm as a villain, being someone who's genuinely justified to be hung up on his failings, because there's nothing he can do to escape them except repeat them. There's a degree of tragedy to this character that made his story stick with me over the years. And that's really what the Gintama experience has been for me and so many others. These incredible characters and stories that just stick with you. Through his death after a dead-end life, Oboro shows us the inevitability of some of the conflicts in this series. But more than anything, he shows us that the end of an inevitable conflict is always tragic, a sentiment that carries over to the real final battle and his spiritual successor. You might be thinking by now that even by shonen standards, Gintama places an inordinate focus on the past and the backstories of its characters. Or at the very least, that's what my analysis makes it seem like. As for why, that has to do with my main takeaway from Gintama, what it means to me. You see, if I had to sum up Gintama in a single word, it would be context. Sure, taking comedic and bizarre moments from the series out of context is hilarious, but I doubt it would be as near and dear to so many hearts if that's all it was. Context is everything in Gintama. to the extent that it can explain away moments like this,
昨日までの俺は猫のケツの穴に吸い込まれて死んだ。
or this,
乳首戻しておきました。
or even
というか口はどこなんだ。
やっぱりカレーだしここでしょ姫。
Okay, maybe not that one. My point is, Gintama works as a series because it plays by its own rules in its own world, and convinces its fans to accept and love them. As for the context behind its emphasis on the past, that has to do with Gintama's main inspiration, Rurouni Kenshin. Gintama was originally a parody of Kenshin, taking the idea of a badass swordsman from a rebellion trying to live in a time of peace with his non-lethal sword. Except in typical Sorachi fashion, he subverted the tone, the historical figures, the setting. You get how it is by this point, he turned everything on its head. But most importantly, Gintama subverted the purpose of the story. Rurouni Kenshin was about a remorseful samurai hung up on the idea of redemption, but Gintama really doesn't care as much. Gintoki might be a reactionary character like Kenshin, but he isn't driven by his past mistakes. In fact, most of the characters have little development and progress because they're not presented as inherently flawed or lacking. Sure, they might have a few screws loose, but they're comfortable in their own skins. As such, what started out as a parody ends up feeling like an answer to Kenshin, telling us it's fine to learn from the past without being black and white about the moral of your mistakes. To accept that neither the past nor present are perfect, and that's alright. This leaves us with a cast of characters that are almost always imperfect, but never inadequate. Because you don't always need to correct your mistakes. You don't need to live a flawless life in order to have a beautiful one. And that was that. Hope you guys enjoyed the second installation of the Appeal of Anime format. Let me know if you want to see more like this, or if you heard anything you strongly agreed or disagreed with in this video. You could also like this video or subscribe to this channel, but you don't get jack shit for that, so I have no idea why you'd consider it. Wink wink. But yeah, that'll have to be it from me for today. If nothing else, you have my thanks for watching.